So, last Sunday, police were called to a residence here in our community, where an adult female and a youth female were being held against their wills and assaulted. A person was arrested and charged with various weapons and drug charges, as well as charges relating to assault and forcible confinement. Then on Wednesday, Ashley Shingoose was finally identified as the previously unknown victim of a Winnipeg serial killer. Her father, in his grief, described her as the most loving, kindest person you would ever meet. Meanwhile, much of the conversation out of the United States this week was related to the scandal where a reporter was mistakenly included in text messages planning airstrike attacks on Yemen. There was no discussion at all about the fact that the US was doing airstrikes on Yemen, or why. That civilians and hospitals might well be hit. It has something to do with Iran and Yemen supporting Gaza, and Saudi Arabia and the US supporting Israel. Something like 25,000 US airstrikes over the last while have resulted in about 19,000 civilian casualties. It's also related to an internal conflict that has resulted in some 377,000 or so deaths in Yemen over the last 10 years. I can't begin to explain the ins and outs of that conflict, but I can say that all sides of that conflict have violated human rights and international humanitarian law. And I know that about 20 million people have been plunged into poverty because of it, that 7 million people are experiencing famine there. In 2025, it ranks 7th among the worst humanitarian crises on the planet. The others include Sudan, where a full 63% of the population needs humanitarian assistance right now. And then there's Syria, where 16.7 million people are in need of aid right now, and 17.6 million displaced Syrians who can't live at home and live around the globe need assistance. Lots of us will be familiar, at least somewhat, of the situation in Gaza and other occupied territories, as we have heard about them on the news. And there's Ukraine, that you will have heard some about, no doubt, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and in Afghanistan, and Ethiopia, and South Sudan, and Chad. In fact, there are so many humanitarian crises on our planet at the moment that different humanitarian organizations and websites simply can't agree on where the need is the greatest. So, that's a little snapshot of this week and the week that has gone by. In such a world, what hope is there for fruits of gentleness or a harvest of peace? Well, I do recall a story about someone who was out on the street as part of a protest. But most of the supporters had long given up and gone home, especially when it started to get darker and it started to rain. But that protester was still there. And when asked why they bothered to stay when they knew that it wouldn't make one bit of difference to the policy they were protesting, the protester said this: "I don't protest here merely in hopes of making them change, although I want that. I'm protesting so that they do not change me." It seems to me, in a world such as this, that our first task is to be reminded of the things that matter to us, to ground ourselves in the values that mean something to us, and then to be directed in our action by those values. Instead of just reacting to the world as it is, instead of slipping into compliance with values that are being promoted by the prevalence of violence and greed everywhere we turn. And in particular, of all of the fruit of the Spirit that we will explore this Lenten season, I think that gentleness is the one that feels the most foreign from the world in which we live. Gentleness is not generally applauded or affirmed or lifted up as a goal to aspire to. In fact, it is so poorly thought of that gentleness may in fact be an act of rebellion, as gentle people quietly move against the grain of the world's noise. Our Fruit of the Week discussion group had some trouble defining gentleness this week. We all had a sense of it, of course. It's something about not being harsh. It seems quiet. There is something to it about preventing harm. It conveys in it a sense of consideration, in the sense of paying attention to the way that your presence and action impacts the person or the thing in front of you, being aware of the effect you have. We were pretty clear that it's not a helpless kind of meekness. And indeed, when we went looking at the biblical images of gentleness, we discovered, as you heard this morning, that they are very often paired with something that we might consider to be the opposite of gentleness. So Isaiah pairs this image of God gently leading a mother sheep and carrying a baby lamb with an image of might and a strong arm for justice. And Paul talks about being meek and gentle, but also at the same time bold. Jesus makes sure that we know there is something about protecting the vulnerable when he welcomes children, but he also uses the image of a yoke, a wooden bar or frame that was used to join animals together to pull a cart or a plow and do heavy work. And then he even suggests that there can be gentleness to this kind of service, so that work can feel like rest, but only if it is held gently and not forced. It rather reminds me, these mixing up of images remind me of that quote by Mahatma Gandhi, "In a gentle way we shake the world." Or that idea you sometimes hear of having a firm back and a soft front. So what does gentleness look like in real life? I wonder whether our ability to be powerful and gentle, or gently powerful, has something to do with our feelings of security. We all know people who mask their insecurity through boasting or bluster. We know people who, because they feel unworthy, will let people take advantage of them or even abuse them. We probably even know people who, due to their insecurity, will try to boss or bully others to get their own way, or get things that they think will make them feel better about themselves. On the other hand, if you feel loved and cared for, if you tend to your spirit and your heart so that you know who you are and to whom you belong, you don't have to show your strength in blustery or loud ways, do you? When you're clear about what truly matters, you don't have to worry about someone pressuring you to do differently or you pressuring someone else. You don't need to prove anything or fight. When you're rooted, you don't blow away in the wind. There is this calm assurance that can help you accept whatever circumstance in which you find yourself. But you need to know and believe your value, how much you are loved, so that you can be gentle with yourself and others. Often some of us are better at one of those than the other. We might be good at being gentle with others and not so gentle with ourselves. We might be good at being gentle with ourselves, but not with the world around us. But think about how strength and gentleness come together in the people you admire. Think of people who you would consider to have gentle souls. And think of the ways that you've seen people respond to adversity with softness rather than aggression. Consider ways you have seen people handle difficult situations with grace and not rushing to judgment. Notice how gentle people show compassion and prevent harm, treating people with respect and dignity in a kind of unhurried sort of way. There's no rushing in gentleness, is there? Have you ever seen someone deliver a difficult message, but deliver it kindly? Maybe that's part of what gentleness can be. I've heard it described that the gentleness can be something that absorbs the shocks from life's unavoidable collisions. It slows down, it observes, it plugs in, never assuming that the right response for today is the right one for tomorrow. Gentleness makes room for humanity, for mistakes, for failure, for forgiveness. It makes space for relationship. Well, over the past weeks, I think we've been observing that these gifts of the Spirit can be cultivated and learned and practiced and grown, but that they also kind of show up as gifts while we're tending to the Spirit. They're not so much summoned, but rather they grow where they are planted and cultivated, so that they're kind of expected, but they're also a surprise. And I wonder if this might be especially true of gentleness, that when we tend to the needs of ourselves and others in an authentic way, gentleness just kind of shows up. Now, we know quite well that the world's suffering will happily steamroll over gentleness as if it doesn't matter. And maybe, in the global sense, it's hard to see that it makes any difference at all. It doesn't seem like our gentleness could save a child with acute malnutrition in Somalia, or help anyone dealing with the sieges and massacres in Burkina Faso, or the gang violence in Haiti. Even in our own federal election that's happening just now, everyone will proclaim that they have the one and right answer, and the loudest voices will probably hold sway. But I trust that it only seems that way. It may not be encouraged, it may be hard to spot, but holding on to gentleness still might just be the only way we hold on to humanity in our world. I still think it's possibly the way that true peace can be cultivated. Cultivated by one person, one action, one small corner at a time. So that gentleness is the interruption in a family system of violence or addiction that changes the course of just one individual who meets another individual, who influences another individual. Gentleness might be the way that someone survives in the face of unthinkable tragedy and is able to help someone else thrive. I think that gentleness might be among the reasons that so many people talk about how much their grandparents influence the way the people they have become. Not all grandparents are gentle, but lots of them are with their grandchildren, aren't they? There is something in gentleness that brings safety and connection which builds creativity and culture. There's something about gentleness that talks about how we are held and how we hold. And we need to hold on to gentleness so we don't lose ourselves. Andy Mort says, gentleness is always an option. This I love. In fact, it's my hope, as I lose my microphone. Oh, whoa. It's my hope that if there is something we hold on to from this week's exploration, it's that even in this world and in our lives, full as they may be of tragedy, that there is power in gentleness, that it reminds us who we are, and that for us, gentleness will always be an option. May it be so. Amen.